for the Southern guns were way back here, 2 or 3 miles back, because they had to be. They would bring them up in small amounts and start. They just could not keep up enough fire. They could not create enough fire to make the dent in the Northern Army in any way they could. And then they began to walk across the battlefield. There's a little spot here, if you ever get a chance to visit, or if you've been there, they call it, there's a stone wall that comes down, it's a little notch and comes down like this. There were guns all along here. This little notch, with Pettigrew's group, there was a regiment, division, I can't remember, about 400, 500 men from a little town in North Carolina. They got to that place. They represented all the men in this town in North Carolina from the age of 14 to 60. All of the men. Every one of them was killed. They walked, every single one of them. They annihilated the entire male population of that town in one volley. That is one of the repercussions of the Civil War, what will happen with an incredible loss of men, males in the South after the Civil War. Because there was huge numbers which just decimated into that. So this is the day. This is the so-called Pickett's charge. Pickett was really only one of 3 generals in charge at this point in time. They had lined up and they started to walk across the mile, first at a walk, then second at a quick pace, and then at the hurry, and then in the last sprint in the double quick. And when they were in the double quick, they got to this line on the Emmitsburg Pike, and they were stopped dead in their tracks. And that's not a metaphor. That's a literalism. That's what the battlefield looked like. For days and days and weeks, and a long period afterwards, the dead strewn the battlefield. It was an incredible event. By the end of day 3, we saw the line that was there. Lee turned his troops and began to try to escape, and the rains came. And all day on the July 4th, it rained and it rained and it rained, and the Rappahannock River rose and it rose and it rose. And Lee was caught with his back to the rising river. And Lincoln said to Meade, "Get in there and finish him off." And Meade said, "No." And there's one of the questions. If it had been Grant and not Meade, what if history is always difficult to do? But we know this. He paused. Now, Lee started out his life as an engineering officer. His back is up against the river. Meade figured he could come in with 85,000 men against what's left of Lee. And he would wait a few days, rest his troops, and come in. You know what Lee did? He built bridges, pontoons, and boats. And he got all of his men, except for a few, maybe 1,000 or 2 of the wounded, across and back into Maryland and finally into Virginia. And the Civil War lasted 2 more bloody years. And Lincoln was, to his dying moment, very unhappy that Meade did not take the advantage and end the war that day. Could he have done it? We'll never know, but he never tried. Now, what makes the Battle of Gettysburg iconic is not just the fact that it is this battle that transformed the Civil War and made it certain that the South was not going to win and that the Union would stand and that the Northern Army would be victorious, but it also became iconic because of what Lincoln did on November 19th, 1863, when he was invited to be a part of the dedication of the first National Soldiers' Cemetery. Now, there's a lot we can talk about cemeteries here, because the cemetery movement is quite an interesting thing that was going on in the mid and early 19th century. Cemeteries are different than church burial grounds, and the cemetery movement was begun in the United States by Edward Everett, and that name should sound familiar because he was the keynote speaker. And at the Gettysburg address, or the Gettysburg presentation, he spoke for 2.5 hours. Now, some of you are sitting here kind of going, it's warm in here and I'm sweating, and he's been at it now for almost 45 minutes, and I'm trying to keep awake. Think about that on a day in November where the guy spoke for 45 minutes, and that was after whole bunches of other programs were going on. And this is a picture of Lincoln coming into town. He's in here someplace, riding a donkey. I happened to, when I was a kid, 8 years old, this is one of the things that got me going. I'm dyslexic. I have a mild case of dyslexia. That's a fascinating thing how I discovered that. But anyway, I was always said that you have a learning disability. I had to go and get tutored because I can't spell. I have Mitchell tattooed here, so I don't misspell the signing checks. And so I had to go to this teacher, a retired teacher. This is 1958. And her father was still living, and he was 102. And he was sitting on the porch, and I got there one time a little early. Mrs. Vire wasn't ready for me, so I sat with Mr. Vire. And we started bright as can be, sharp as a tack, and started talking. And he's sitting there, he said, I meet you and all this sort of stuff. And I don't know how we got around to the conversation, but he talked about when he had met Teddy Roosevelt. And I went, you met Teddy Roosevelt? Yeah, well, I was on the city council when he came through here campaigning for the presidency in for vice presidency in 1900, whatever, 1900. I'm just sitting there, aghast. He said, but my most favorite memory is when I saw Lincoln. And I went, what? And he had been a little boy, not far from Gettysburg, when Lincoln had arrived on the train, and he remembered him. His father took him down in the street. He was 6 years old in 1863, and saw Lincoln riding from the train station into town on a donkey, on a mule. And all he can remember is that he was so big, the mule looked so little. And I'm sitting there going, you saw Abraham Lincoln? This wasn't history, this was current events. I am one person away from Abraham Lincoln. You ever know that, 6 degrees of separation? I know men who saw Lincoln when he was alive and president. That was one of the things that started to impel me towards the interest in history, Lincoln, the Civil War, etc., etc. So here we have it. This is the only picture we have, although there's a rumor out there on the mill now that they found some other pictures that were taken that day. But this was, the photographer had been set up and he'd been taking pictures of Edward Everett, who is right there. That's his head, Edward Everett. That's Abraham Lincoln, right there. The guy was getting his plates all put together. He figured he'd have plenty of time because the president was going to speak. He's a politician. He's going to speak a whole long period of time. 407 years ago, our forefather lived in 2 minutes, 42 seconds, sat down. The guy looked up and said, "My God!" Quick took the picture. As Lincoln sat down. Right in here, that hot hat and another one in here are two students from Gettysburg College who eventually became professors at Gettysburg, who eventually became professors for my professor when I was an undergraduate. And they argued their whole life, Professor Gris told us, about what pieces of paper Lincoln actually used to give the Gettysburg Address. Here is a copy of what we think are the pieces that he actually held in his hand. There are 5 holographic, and you can pass this around for people to look at it. I do need that. And they're just off of a computer, so they're not valuable. There are 5 holographic samples of the Gettysburg Address. That means 5 copies in Lincoln's handwriting.